Good evening. Welcome to tonight's event, Rescuing the Traumatized Brain. Tonight's webinar is being recorded and participants are in listen-only mode for the duration of the event. My name is Ruth Price Rollins, and I am the president of the Greater Cleveland Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We are so pleased to be able to host this informative webinar entitled Rescuing the Traumatized Brain. As Valentine's Day approaches, we understand that everyone may not be celebrating. And in fact, some may be suffering emotionally from many traumatic events. We hope that you find this webinar informative and that it provides you with resources to assist in managing traumatic events. Welcome and thank you for attending. I will now turn it over with thanks to our Physical and Mental Health Committee member, Soar Vicki Turner, to introduce tonight's speaker. Soar Turner.
Thank you, President Price Rollins. Dr. Hugh A. Turner is a clinical psychologist who has been in practice for 34 years. He has broad and in-depth experience evaluating and providing psychological services to individuals, groups, state agencies, and the federal government. Hugh graduated from Capital University and received his doctorate from Florida Tech University. He is the author of From Pink Slip to Green Power, A Life Makeover for the Over 40 Crowd. And he is the developer of the board game app Oriomi, available for iOS and Android systems in March 2021. Hugh currently devotes his professional energies to assisting individuals who have experienced psychosocial trauma. Dr. Turner has spent several years studying African culture in West Africa and Brazil, and in 1996, he was initiated into a West African priesthood in Nigeria. Hugh is married to Vicki in the greater Cleveland area, and we warmly welcome Dr. Hugh Turner.
Thank you, President Ruth Price Rollins, Chairwoman Kalia Fisher Grace, and Program Chair and my dear wife, Dr. Vicki Turner. I'm honored to be with you this evening to share with you what I believe to be the existential challenge facing African Americans today. That is, trauma experienced by the individual as a result of physical, mental, and/or emotional abuse, and the effects societal trauma has placed on African Americans as a result of the systemic devaluation of African American life. Before I begin my presentation, it is my custom to pay homage to my ancestors for allowing me to be here this evening before you. So if you would allow me, it will take me just about an hour or so. I'd like to pay homage to my great-great-great-grandparents, Elias Thomas and Jenny Wells, my great-great-grandparent, Harry Turner and his wife, Matilda, my great-grandparent, William S. Turner and his wife, Pearl, and my parents, Jesse Thaddeus Turner, and my mother, Pearl. Thank you all, and I give all my respect and honor to my ancestors. Also, before I get into the presentation, some of the material that I will present is going to be quite graphic. And some of you may be disturbed by the images. So before I show that material, I will let you know so you can take care of yourselves. Also, at the beginning of the presentation, there is a brief 10-question questionnaire that I would like for you to complete. This questionnaire is for your eyes only. You're not going to turn it in. You're not going to be quizzed on it. So you're going to need a pencil and something to write with to complete that. The questions, the way you score the question is that every yes answer to the questionnaire represents 1 point. And a little later during the presentation, I will let you know what your scores mean in terms of trauma. The objectives tonight are to define and develop an understanding of trauma, describe the neurobiological implications of trauma, and the effects on intimate and social relationships. We also want to explain the genesis of transgenerational traumatic stress experience. We want to explore TTSC's impact on race consciousness, and finally, to suggest methods of minimizing the effects of individual trauma as well as racial trauma. So if you have your pencil and writing instruments, I'm going to give you the first 3 questions of the questionnaire, and I'll give you a little time to answer those questions. There are 10 questions in total. I won't read them, so you can read the questions for yourself. All right, here are the next 3 questions. And the last 4 questions. Okay, let's continue on. So let's go to the first section, traumatic stress. What is trauma? Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, also known as SAMHSA, reports that there are 3 events that comprise trauma, and you can remember them as the 3 E's. Trauma results from an event or series of events, and the person experiencing the trauma feels that their life may be in jeopardy. That's the result of the emotional or physical or sexual position that the person has been put into. And that the experience has long-lasting effects on the individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional well-being. It's interesting that when we talk about trauma, most people think about trauma as an event that they experience. However, trauma can also be experienced vicariously. It can be experienced as, for instance, when we all saw Mr. Floyd being killed. That was trauma, and that trauma has impacted a number of people. So trauma can be experienced vicariously, and to experience it vicariously is just as harmful as experiencing it to yourself or personally. There are many types of trauma. Childhood neglect, or living with a family member with a mental health or substance abuse disorder, sudden unexplained separation from a loved one, and of course, the trauma associated with poverty, discrimination, and generational trauma. When trauma occurs before age 18, the effects can be long-lasting in terms of the development and life outcomes. The survey that you completed is from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. And this came about through research conducted in 1998 by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and Kaiser Permanente. The results of that survey was groundbreaking information that related child abuse and neglect and household problems to later health outcomes. One of the outcomes of the survey was that trauma is very common. The survey was given to a little over 17,000 individuals during routine physical exams. And as a result of that, the experimenters were able to determine that 64% of the individuals taking the survey had experienced at least one significant trauma in their life. That was almost 2 out of every 3 respondents who responded to the survey. There was very little difference between male and female responders. 62% of men and 65% of women reported that they had had a traumatic experience. The important point of this survey was that the more traumatic experiences that a person had, the more they experienced lessened life outcomes. So the survey that you took, if you had 1 or 2 yeses on that survey, you're probably about normal. If you had 4 or more, then the survey would suggest that you may have had some significant issues as a result of those issues. One of the outcomes of that survey was that individuals who had one traumatic experience in terms of smoking, 6 out of 100 individuals smoked. But if you had 7 traumatic experiences, 17 out of 100 individuals smoked. In terms of suicide attempts, if you had 1 traumatic experience, the ratio was 1 out of 100 attempted suicides. However, if you had 7, it went up to 1 in 5. 20 individuals out of 100 had attempted or thought about suicide. The psychological effects of traumatic stress can be listed as internal and external. Internally, an individual who has experienced significant trauma may be seen as chronically depressed. They may have various physical concerns and health challenges. They may harbor feelings of self-hate and self-blame, difficulties trusting, or being overly dependent on others, and feeling hopeless about the future. And I'm going to go through why this is just a little later on in the presentation. In terms of external symptoms of trauma, we will see individuals who are irritable and or have angry outbursts with little or no provocation. They may engage in reckless and or self-destructive behaviors. They may be in a chronic state of high alert or even exhibiting paranoid behavior. Individuals experiencing significant trauma will have difficulty falling or staying asleep. They may engage in obsessive compulsive behaviors as coping mechanisms. They will typically have a history of failed or unsatisfying relationships. Now, I want to step off of the reservation for a minute. For those of you who are therapists, in our clinical training, we were trained that these behaviors that I just listed are signs of a disorder. They're signs of a disorder. But I want you to begin to think about these behaviors as not as a disorder, but as a person's coping mechanisms that help them to deal with an unreal situation. Coping mechanisms. They have experienced significant trauma in their lives, and perhaps the only way that they could get through that experience is to develop coping mechanisms that look like these behaviors that help them to carry themselves through the world in as normal a position as they can. The other thing about the way we have learned to categorize these behaviors, seeing a person with these issues, it's easy for us to ask, what's wrong with that person? What is wrong with that person? But rather than asking what's wrong, we may want to, in our own mind, replace that question with, what happened to you? What happened to you? Because all of these behaviors are the direct result of a horrific experience that the person had that has made them who they are. Now, perhaps you can't ask a person what happened to you, but in your own mind, maybe you can rephrase that question from what is wrong with you to, I wonder what happened to you. Okay. The long-term effects of trauma, and these are just the most salient. There are health effects, obesity, diabetes, COPD, heart disease, cancer. Behaviorally, smoking, alcoholism, unsafe sex. In terms of life potential, individuals who have experienced significant trauma have poor graduation rates, poor school achievement, poor lifetime income, and finally, individuals who have experienced significant trauma have a shortened life. Now, you may want to ask, why? Why are these physical symptoms, including shortened life, an effect of trauma? Well, let's go to the next slide and look at the neurobiological consequences of prolonged and or intense trauma. So to help you visualize the effects of trauma, this is a cutout, of course, of the brain. We consider the brain to be in three parts, I'm only going to talk about two parts. This part is what we would call the limbic system, and it is the seat of emotions, impulsive behavior, irrational behavior. And of course, here is the neocortex. And this part of the brain at the front is the neocortex, and it is responsible for rational, logical thought. It allows us to make sense of the world. So when we get when our senses sends a signal to us of something that is happening in the world, that signal goes to the limbic system and it goes to the neocortex. The limbic, when it gets to the limbic system, if it is an incident of danger, the limbic system sends a message to the hippocampus. The hippocampus confirms that the incident is dangerous, and the amygdala here prepares the body to fight, flee, or freeze. Now, that same signal is sent to the neocortex. However, the signal traveling to the neocortex travels a little slower than the signal traveling to the limbic system. So let's say that you are walking down the street and you hear a car backfiring. That sound sends a signal to the limbic system and you startle. You go on high alert. That same signal is going to the neocortex, and the neocortex sends a signal back to you. It's just a car backfiring. Slow down. You don't have to get all bent out of shape. And you go along your merry way. However, if the limbic system, the amygdala and the hippocampus, have been damaged by trauma, if that happens, the neocortex does not serve that rationalizing function. And the signals going to the limbic system sends the amygdala into high alert. And when it goes into high alert, it prepares you to flee, fight, or freeze. Because the neocortex has been damaged as a result of the trauma, it does not send a mediating signal to the limbic system saying everything is all right. From the limbic system, because it is activated, the person acts impulsively, perhaps rashly, because they fear that they're in a dangerous situation. So how does this play out in, let's say, on the job? A person who has experienced trauma may be on their job and a coworker may say something that is a trigger for the individual who has experienced trauma. And because it is a trigger, it sends the limbic system into high alert. And while the limbic system is in high alert, the person is no longer talking to a coworker. They are responding to the trauma that the trigger has brought back to their conscious mind. And in that situation, they will, or most often, respond in an irrational, impulsive manner that does not promote a good relationship with their coworker. So the more intense the traumatic experience, the more irrational behavior that will be exhibited in the face of a trauma. Or, I'm sorry, in the face of a trigger. And the trigger could be any innocuous thing. It does not necessarily, and most often will not be associated with the actual trauma. Now, when the limbic system goes into high alert, it causes the body to release stress hormones. In addition to neurotransmitters releasing other chemicals that have prepared the body for significant fight, flight, or freeze. If you want to think about this, think about getting in your car, starting it up, putting your foot on the brake, and pressing the accelerator to the floor at the same time. Something will break. That's the same thing that a person who has been exposed to significant stress is experiencing in their body. The brake and the gas pedal are both pressed, and eventually a system has to break. And that is why you will have some individuals who have experienced significant trauma having a shortened lifespan and experiencing the other issues that go along with the traumatic experience. Okay, moving on. When we talk about treating individuals with trauma, there are good treatments for trauma. However, individuals with trauma do not respond well to simple talk therapy. They do not respond well to simple talk therapy. And if a person who has experienced trauma is engaged in simple talk therapy, just the idea of talking about the trauma can be re-traumatizing. So there are a couple of ways that we can assist an individual who is experiencing trauma. And one is called uh, bottom up, and the other is called top down. All of these resources here are a combination of bottom up with talk therapy. So the first task to help a person with trauma is to heal the limbic system. Heal the limbic system. We have to tone down the amygdala and re-empower the cortex, neocortex. The interesting thing about trauma is that trauma responds to tactile stimulation and movement. Tactile stimulation and movement. That is why you see practitioners who are treating trauma as a part of their treatment milieu most often will have some form of Ttsc, Qigong, even martial arts. That movement has a way of reorganizing the limbic system, that amygdala and hippocampus, in such a way as the person can begin to get their emotions under control. The other point that I want to make is that trauma, the effects of trauma, are experienced on the right side of the brain. The right side of the brain is where we have art, music, expressions of artistic expressions. The left side of the brain is the logical side of the brain. Oftentimes people will define their trauma as the unspeakable terror. The unspeakable terror. And it is defined that way because the individual who has experienced trauma, they may be able to tell you what happened in the traumatic experience, but they do not have words to relay to you the terror that that traumatic experience caused. It's unspeakable. That's why the talk therapy, which is a left brain exercise requiring logic and rationalization, does not touch trauma, because trauma is a right brain experience. So these are some of the resources that I'm familiar with to address trauma. Emotional freedom techniques, and there's the looks at tapping on pressure points to release blocked up energy that is the result of trauma. EMDR, which is very good, looks at eye movement desensitization. For some reason, and a neurologist could perhaps explain, rapid movements of the eye back and forth has a way of pouring water on that hot limbic system so that the person is better able to get in control of their emotions. Gestalt therapy, of course, energy psychology, and my favorite, synergistic spiritual counseling. And that's my favorite because that's what I do. Dialectical behavior therapy is good. However, I did not see an organization for dialectical behavior therapy, and I didn't want to identify a particular individual as a resource. But these are all good resources. The other treatments, if you want to call it that, particularly for African American kids, is rhythmic drumming. Rhythmic drumming. There's a drum called the djembe, and some schools have taught kids who were in SPH classes to play the djembe drum, and it has a way of pouring water on that hot limbic system, cooling them down. So that's another good therapy. So check these out. Particularly check out energy psychology, because there are a lot of techniques that a parent can use with a child, or individuals can do with each other, that can pour water on that hot limbic system. Okay, so moving right along. Oh, I didn't want to go there. So let's talk a bit about transgenerational traumatic stress experience. What's different about transgenerational traumatic stress experience is that it is passed down through DNA. If you can imagine the horror that our ancestors experienced during that slave experience, the horror of Jim Crow during that experience, and the far too frequent televised experiences of Black on Black trauma, and trauma that comes at the hands of a system that's represented by officials who have license to engage in behaviors that put our lives in jeopardy. Those are all traumatic experiences that are experienced at a racial level and passed down through altered DNA. Now, this next section is going to have some pictures that are going to be graphic. So you might want to prepare to not watch. You can listen, or just take care of yourself. So Ttsc, what is it? It is trauma experienced by a group. It's experienced multi-generationally by the group's descendants. The trauma experience is unavoidable. And the trauma experience alters the group's psychoneurobiological functioning through systemic dehumanization. And we're going to cover primarily three periods: slavery from 1619 to 1865, and the principal traumatic experience during slavery was religion. Post-slavery to 1968 is the Jim Crow era, and the instruments of dehumanization were physical intimidation, the media, and education. 1968 to the present is the systemic marginalization of Black life. So let's start with slavery. Slavery and religion. When the captives were brought to this hemisphere, they came with the gods that they served in Africa. And those gods helped them to survive the horrors and the hardships of slavery. Now, interestingly, captives who were taken to the Caribbean were able to hide their gods within the Europeans' religion, because that religion in the Caribbean was mostly Catholicism. And the gods that the slaves brought with them served purposes similar to the Catholic saints. So they were simply able to change names. They took and gave their gods the names of saints. And this practice is still being carried out in Brazil. In America, a Protestant country, the slaves were not allowed to keep their religion. However, religion was used to control the slaves. The Anglicans were missionaries who preached to the slave masters and the slaves. The message to the slave master was a paternal message, to treat their slaves like the children they were. However, the message to the slaves was, your master is on a par with God. You must obey your master. This was a way of controlling many of the slaves. However, even in the midst of this, we had certain individuals who looked at religion as empowering rather than an instrument of subversion. subtle, keeping one in bondage. So we think about, in that sense, we think about Sojourner Truth, Denmark Vesey, Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey. They took the religion that was given and saw the truth in it and made that religion the marching song that they use in an attempt to bring about change for themselves and for their fellow slaves. Today, the religion of those great people, Malcolm, Martin Luther King, can be seen in many of our churches that have taken up the task of social crusade. However, unfortunately, there are churches among us today whose philosophy is the same as the plantation religion that their ancestors were subjected to all those hundreds of years ago. So we still have the plantation with us, but we also have the fighters who carry on the work of Denmark Vesey, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells. After slavery, during the Jim Crow era, the African American was kept under control by horrific scenes like this, lynchings. Now, this is what I want you to understand. During Jim Crow, at the beginning of Jim Crow, there were white sharecroppers and there were black folk working on those same farms. The white individuals, for the most part in the beginning, did not participate in this type of behavior. However, if we look at the history, and I will show you a little later, this type of behavior became the instrument of control, and it was a double-edged sword. This type of behavior showed the African American that she was less than human. But it also set in play the thought in the minds of those Caucasians who were just as disadvantaged, that they somehow were better or more human than the African Americans that were being lynched. So on the one hand, we had a system that dehumanized African Americans, and on the other hand, conditioned Caucasians to believe that they were better than. So the question becomes, who is responsible for the lynching, and who is responsible for conditioning white folk to believe that they were better than and to accept the inhuman behavior that's being exhibited. So for that, we have to go to the media at the time. These are all cartoons that were popular up until the 60s. And I have to tell you, some of these cartoons I laughed at when I was a kid. Castle Films was one of the main proponents of this dehumanization. So the idea here instills in the mind that African Americans are less than human, just like the lynching. But here, it's more subtle, because now you got little white boys and little white girls looking at these films, and they are developing the mindset that Africans are less than they are less than human. And I think if we really look at it, you can find some parallels in the what's being portrayed in the media relative to African American experience today. Those cartoons allowed this to take place because for society, these kids less than human. We could lock them up, chain them, because they were less than human. These kids in the impoverished situation that they exist, society could be okay with this because these particular kids are less than human. From an educational perspective, I want you to think about the book, Miseducation of the Negro, because that's appropriate here. This is a picture that's supposed to be Africa. This landmass does not represent any landmass on the planet. Just like if you look at a globe, the land masses on a globe, the proportions, do not represent any landmass on the planet. But these representations are political representations. If you look at the continent that we live on, America, you could put America here in this, almost in the Sahara Desert, along with Europe, South America, and most parts of China. But that's not how the map is depicted. But on this map, I want to bring your attention to Egypt up here. And this blue line is the Nile River, supposedly the longest river in the world. There's competition between the Nile and the Amazon. But if you look at this picture, it would look like the Nile is flowing from the Mediterranean down. Now, that's important because whenever we talk about land and cultivation and civilization, we always think about civilization starting at the mouth of the river or the source of the water and flowing down. So if you take our Mississippi, it starts in the north and flows down. Our industry, our seats of finance, government come from the north down. So looking at this map, you would say that the great civilization of Egypt perhaps got some of its influence from the Mediterranean area, being Greece, and flowed down. But remember, Africa, much of Africa is below the equator. So I have a different perspective that I want to show you. If we look at the map this way, then we see the source of the Nile flowing down and emptying into the Mediterranean. Now, why is this important? For those of you who have visited Egypt and have visited the temple of Ramesses II, if you recall, Ramesses in your visit is looking, his statues are looking out over that body of water. That body of water is the result of the Aswan Dam that was not flooded initially. It came about as the dam was created and it flooded that area. So there's a lot of temples and monuments beneath that water. But what I want to explain is that if we follow back up to the Sudan, there's a community or a country within Sudan called Meroe. Meroe. And Meroe is the home in Sudan of pyramids and temples on par almost with those in Egypt. And when we think about Ramesses looking towards Sudan, it's not too stretch of an imagination to think that Egyptian civilization started in what is Nubia, around Meroe, and that culture came down the Nile and flourished in Egypt. Of course, Nubia is an African name for Black people. So if we look at this image of Africa, with South Africa up here being closer to Antarctica, this would be north, and Egypt down here would be south in the southern hemisphere. What if our kids were being taught that they come from a people who created medicine in the name of Imhotep? They charted the stars. The Dogon people charted stars, and we don't know how they did it because they didn't have telescopes. What would they think of themselves? How would they feel about themselves? I think they would be vastly different than the way they are taught to feel about themselves today. These two individuals are exactly the same. One has been conditioned to believe that he's inferior, and the other has been conditioned to believe that he's superior. Because of these kids being conditioned to believe that they are superior, they look at others who are unlike them as superior, inferior, and will not want them to receive an education alongside of them. I think we may all be familiar with this picture. And the question has to be asked, was this parent doing this child a favor by having her go to school escorted by marshals? Again, here we have a little girl, and I think you can see the fear in her face. And these parents are in this classroom to protect their kids from this little girl. This is the result, or this is the start of transgenerational trauma. And of course, this brings it all home. This brings it all home. He can do this because he does not respect this man's humanity. And if you count them, there are at least 17 police officers making sure this Black man and what he represents does not get off his knees. In contrast, we all saw this expression of Trumpian privilege. Where are the cops? Where are the cops? So all of this is the instruments of instilling traumatic stress generationally. The effects on race consciousness, I believe, is fear. Fear of introspection. We don't want to look deeply inside of us to ask the question, what am I doing? What is being done to me? And what can I do to correct this? And because we have fear of introspection, we become reactionary. We react. We march. We boycott. But that might not be the thing that we can do to get ourselves out of the situation we're in. We have fear of acceptance of group efficacy. Too many of us expect that the European is going to do a job much better, much quicker than our own brethren. But of course, our brethren sometimes, or most times, don't do the things that they need to do to instill the confidence that we need to see in them. So we accept inefficiency and we accept an inability to believe that I'm going to get a pound of reward for a pound of effort. And we have a fear of being proactive. We see things going on around us, but we fail to act in an effective way that is designed to ensure our well-being and the well-being of our kids. So suggestions for managing the effects of TTSC. The only thing I can say is read. You have to familiarize yourself with the instruments of our dehumanization. And you find that in various books written by African American and African authors. So in rescuing the traumatized brain, we looked at what trauma is, the 3 E's. It's an event, it's an experience, and it's long lasting. We looked and we observed that trauma is common. The psychological effects are both internal and external. And the effects of trauma has long-term consequences that can lead to shortened life expectancy. Neurobiological consequences result in the body being under constant stress and needing to be released. Some of the disciplines that we talked about is EMDR, Gestalt, energy psychology, and spiritual techniques. In terms of TTSC, we talked about what it is, systemic dehumanization. produced by slavery, Jim Crow, and marginalization. And we looked at the effects on race and possible next steps: reading, 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 educating oneself. I think this sums it up, and it's from Isaiah 58:9-1. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. And I put this here because in order for us to help ourselves, we have to be able and willing to help others. We have to help our brethren raise from their sense of oppressive condition and walk in the light. That's all for this presentation. I want to thank you for being with you. If there are questions, I think we may have a little time to answer those.
So, Crystal, are you able to see the questions from the chat?
Yes, sorry. So the first question is, living within the pandemic but not getting sick, considered trauma?
Living in the pandemic but not getting sick?
Yes, is that considered trauma?
The pandemic is considered trauma. Living in the pandemic is definitely traumatic. It doesn't matter if you get sick or not, just the alteration in lifestyle is traumatic. And particularly if you have people that you know of who may have gotten really sick or even died, that is significant trauma. So yeah, living through the pandemic, even if you don't get sick, is traumatic.
Okay, the next question is, someone would like to know if you have a website or podcast that they could follow.
The website is on the screen now. synergisticspiritualcounseling.com, as well as the contact number, phone number.
And the last question is, for those who have an inactive limbic system and tend to freeze as opposed to react or overreact, how is this explained through trauma, and how can we manage to activate emotions?
Yeah, when a person is under trauma, they're going to do what they need to do to survive. And if you freeze, individuals who freeze in trauma have developed that coping technique to help them survive. So think about a child who is being emotionally or physically, sexually abused, laying in their bed, and they hear footsteps outside their bedroom door. They can't go anyplace. They can't fight. So they freeze. They freeze, and in some cases, allow their mind to go someplace else. I hope that clears that up.
And those are all the questions in the chat.
Thank you, Crystal.
You're welcome.
Crystal, I don't know if you saw, it looks like there was one final question that just got put in.
Oh, okay. Are there any techniques to deal with or heal from systematic racial trauma?
Yes, there are, but it requires that you begin to educate yourself. One technique, if you can do this, is through ritual. And if you want to give me a call, I can give you more information on how ritual works to relieve or reduce transgenerational trauma.
The next question is, can we support someone to learn how to be emotive or express or feel rather than always freeze?
Yeah, you can, if you know of a person that freezes, what you can do as one human being to another is to get them moving. Being involved in Ttsc or being involved in martial arts, the rhythmic moving is the best medicine that a non-professional can do to support someone who has experienced trauma. Or if they are inclined, drumming. Drumming is another good or technique for that a person can do to help another human being, particularly if that person is not a therapist. So to reduce the effects of trauma, rhythmic movement is the best medicine.
And someone just asked, what do you think of yoga and meditation for trauma?
Excellent. Excellent.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, therapists who deal with trauma will try to incorporate some aspects of yoga, meditation, mindfulness in the therapeutic process to help the individual pour water on that hot limbic system. Yoga is good.
And someone also asked, what books do you recommend?
For transgenerational?
I'm waiting for them to answer that. They just said, what books do you recommend? It just says from M. I don't.
Okay, if it's transgenerational, I would look at Carter G. Woodson, of course, Wayne Chandler, of course, W.E.B., of course, study the lives of Marcus Garvey, study the lives of Ida B. Wells. We've got a lot of heroes and sheroes whose life exemplifies the breaking the chain of transgenerational trauma. And they're out there. Google is fantastic. Just Google those individuals. You know, and there's a book coming out by Skip Gates, The Black Church. I've not read it. I've heard talk of it, but I think because it's from Gates, it's going to be good. So make that part of your library also.
And those are all the questions in the chat.
Okay.
So Crystal, thank you for reading those questions. And Dr. Turner, again, on behalf of Delta Sigma Theta, Greater Cleveland Alumni Chapter, we thank you for the time you took to talk to us about trauma and really give us a new way of looking at trauma that we may not have had in the past. I think if you've been able to see any of the comments in the chat, it's all very positive. People are very appreciative of the words that you have shared. So for those of you that were participants in tonight's event, you will receive an email through Eventbrite asking you to complete an evaluation of our event this evening. We thank you for joining us, and please just look out for other programs that we'll have coming in the future. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.